My name is Elian Voss, and I have mopped these floors for 3 months. I know every vein in the marble. I know which tiles near the east elevator squeak under the weight of a mop bucket. I know that the third floor break room smells like burnt coffee at exactly 7:15 every morning because Marcus from accounting always forgets the timer. I know the way sunlight angles through the glass atrium at noon, turning the whole lobby gold, and I know how to disappear before anyone important arrives to see it. I am very good at disappearing. The janitor's uniform helps: gray polo, gray trousers, a gray cap I pull low over my face. The industrial cart with its mop and bucket and spray bottles is its own kind of invisibility cloak. People look through you when you're holding a mop. Their eyes slide past like water over glass. Executives, assistants, delivery personnel, they all do it. Some murmur polite apologies when they step around my bucket. Most don't bother. I've learned to prefer the ones who don't bother. At least they're honest about what they see. What they see is a janitor. A young one, maybe mid-20s, slight in the shoulders, with an increasingly difficult time bending at the waist. That last part is new. 3 months ago when I took this job, I could still pretend the curve of my stomach was just the soft roundness of someone who'd been eating well. Now, at nearly 6 months along, pretending is a full-time job layered on top of my actual full-time job. I am pregnant. I am an Omega. And I am cleaning the offices of Voshale Enterprises, the company my mother built from nothing and my father ran into the ground and which was subsequently purchased, restructured, and elevated into something magnificent by the man whose child I am carrying. His name is Cale Draven. He is the CEO of this building. He is the alpha whose scent still lives in my memory like a bruise I keep pressing. And he does not know I'm here. I intend to keep it that way. The morning I started, HR barely looked at me. The woman processing my paperwork, a sharp-faced beta named Sandra with reading glasses perpetually perched at the end of her nose, had glanced at my application, confirmed my identification, and assigned me to the overnight and early morning cleaning crew without a second thought. I had used my mother's maiden name. Elian Voss became Elian Marsh on the paperwork. It wasn't difficult. My mother had kept meticulous records under both names during her years of corporate maneuvering, and I had grown up watching her become whoever the room needed her to be. I inherited her cheekbones and, apparently, her talent for reinvention. What I hadn't inherited was her immunity to alphas. Cale Draven had walked into my life at a charity gala 14 months ago, a world I'd been invited to as a ghost, a plus one, the quiet Omega son of a disgraced family trying to build something new from the wreckage. He hadn't known who I was. I hadn't known who he was. We had spoken for 40 minutes near a window overlooking a city that glittered like scattered coins, and by the end of those 40 minutes, I had understood something fundamental about the way the universe worked. It didn't care about your plans. 3 weeks of meetings that were supposed to be business turned into evenings that were supposed to be casual turned into a night that was supposed to be just once. His scent, cedar and rain and something darker underneath, something that made my Omega instincts go very quiet and very certain, had dismantled every wall I'd carefully constructed. The heat had come early. Unexpected. I hadn't been on suppressants, a choice I'd made for health reasons, planning to restart them the following month. The night had happened, and it had been devastating in the most beautiful way, and in the morning I had found a note on his side of the bed and a carefully folded card with his assistant's contact information rather than his own. I had understood that message perfectly. 2 months later, when the test confirmed what I'd already suspected, I had made my decision alone, in a bathroom that smelled like cheap cleaning products, in the apartment I could barely afford. I would keep the baby. I would not contact him. The last thing I wanted was to be the Omega who showed up at the powerful Alpha's door with a pregnancy as leverage. I had my pride. I had exactly my pride and approximately 400 credits in a savings account and a growing collection of second-hand baby items I hid under my bed. The job at Voshale had come through a placement agency. I'd needed something with flexible early hours that would let me take online courses in the afternoon and still afford rent. The irony that the universe had deposited me in his building hadn't escaped me. I'd considered refusing. I'd stared at the placement details for 20 minutes and then thought about my bank balance and my rent and the small person who was going to need things I couldn't name yet, and I'd accepted. I told myself it was fine. He was the CEO of a 40-floor tower. I was the janitor on floors 2 through 8 during the pre-dawn shift. Our worlds didn't overlap. They never would, I had been so confident in this plan. The thing about working in a building for 3 months is that the building starts to feel like yours. Not in any ownership sense, I'm not delusional, but in the intimate way that comes from knowing its rhythms before the people who own it arrive to claim it each day. I know when the heating system shutters on at 5:50 a.m. I know that the executive elevator makes a faint grinding sound on descent that the maintenance team has been ignoring for 6 weeks. I know that someone on the fourth floor, I suspect it's the head of marketing, a beta woman named Petra who works impossible hours, keeps a small photo of a dog tucked behind her monitor, angled so visitors can't see it but she can. I know which conference rooms smell like stress and which ones smell like boredom. I know that the executive suite on the 40th floor is always off limits to my crew, a separate cleaning service handles it, one that apparently operates under an NDA thick enough to require its own filing cabinet. I know that my colleagues know something I don't. It started small. Subtle things I might have ignored if I weren't already hyper-aware of my own secret. Yusuf, our crew supervisor, a stocky, kind-faced beta in his 50s who had worked in building services for 2 decades, had a particular way of going slightly still when he looked at me in the early weeks. Not unpleasant. Not predatory. More like a man recalibrating something in his head, settling a question he wasn't sure he had the right to ask. Dolores, who ran the 4th and 5th floors and always had hard candies in her pocket that she pressed into people's palms unsolicited, had started giving me the easier assignments 3 weeks in. The ones that didn't require climbing or heavy lifting. When I thanked her, she just shrugged and said, "The east stairwell needs love, and my back is better than yours right now." She said right now with the particular emphasis of someone who knows more than they're saying and has decided not to say it. Even Marcus from accounting, not technically on my crew but a man who arrived early enough to cross paths with us regularly, had started leaving an extra coffee at the end of the second-floor service hallway on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Black with 1 sugar, which happened to be exactly how I took it, which I had mentioned exactly once in a passing conversation 3 weeks prior. They were protecting me. Quietly, collectively, without ever once saying my name or acknowledging what they were doing. I didn't know what they knew or how they knew it, but I could feel it in the particular gentleness with which my world had begun to arrange itself around me. I chose not to examine it too closely. I had enough to manage. At 6 months, the physical work was becoming a study in creative problem solving. I'd developed a system for the mopping that minimized bending. I kept my movements slow and deliberate, conserving energy for the hours ahead. I wore a loose jacket over my uniform on the mornings when my stomach felt particularly prominent, even though the building's interior was warm enough that Dolores had started giving me concerned looks about overheating. The baby moved constantly. I'd started thinking of him. I didn't know the sex yet, hadn't been able to afford the imaging, as a him. He had a schedule, quiet in the early hours while I worked, enthusiastically active when I sat down to rest. He seemed to like the hum of the building systems, the distant vibration of the ventilation. He'd settle into a gentle rolling motion at the low frequencies that came up through the floor tiles and I would stand very still with my mop handle as an anchor and let him have his moment. I had taken to talking to him in my head during the long, quiet work hours. Not anything profound. Just narration. This is the second-floor conference room. The long table fits 20 but they usually only use 8 seats. The window faces north so it never gets direct sun. It's probably the least cheerful room in the building but the acoustics are nice. He seemed to appreciate the information or at least tolerated my need to provide it. It was during one of these internal narration sessions, on a Tuesday morning 6 weeks into my tenure, that I first realized how completely known I was in this building. I'd been restocking the supply closet on the 3rd floor, a task I'd taken on to avoid the heavier cleaning that morning, when my back had decided to voice its opinions loudly, when I heard Yusuf speaking quietly in the hallway outside. He was on his radio, calling in a supply order, and his voice had the particular careful neutrality of a man choosing every word, just adding it to the standing request, he said. Lighter solution for the east wing floors. And check on the availability of the ergonomic push handle we discussed. The long model, a pause, no, it's not a safety issue. It's a personnel accommodation. Just process it as standard. He signed off and I stood in the supply closet with a box of paper towels in my arms and my heart doing something complicated in my chest. He was ordering equipment modifications for me. Not because I'd asked. Not because there was any policy requiring it. Because he'd looked at me for several weeks and made a decision I hadn't been consulted about, and the decision was, we take care of our own. I put the paper towels on the shelf very carefully and stood there for a moment breathing. This building was going to make me cry at completely inconvenient times. That was already clear. I had managed, in 3 months, to construct an almost perfect ignorance of Cale Draven's daily existence in this building. I knew he was here, his presence was architectural, woven into the decisions that had shaped every floor from lobby to executive suite. The company bore the first half of his name. His photograph appeared in the lobby in that particular way that powerful people's photographs appear in lobbies, formal, slightly larger than life, designed to communicate stability rather than personality. In it, he looked like what he was, an alpha at the peak of his authority, sharp-jawed, dark-eyed, wearing his power like a perfectly fitted suit. I had stopped walking through the lobby by my second week. The service entrance on the building's north side suited me fine, but I knew things despite myself. The receptionist on the second floor, a chatty young man named Dev who treated the cleaning crew like colleagues rather than furniture, had a habit of narrating his mornings to anyone within earshot. From Dev I learned, entirely against my will, that Cale Draven arrived each morning between 7 and 7:30. That he had a standing coffee order. That he had restructured 3 departments in the past 6 months in ways that had apparently made the company dramatically more efficient and most of the restructured employees somehow more satisfied rather than less, which Dev described as borderline supernatural. From Petra, who I encountered occasionally in the early evening when she stayed late and I came in for a brief afternoon touch-up shift I'd volunteered for, I learned that the CEO had a reputation for fairness that was apparently unusual enough to be noteworthy. He remembers people, she told me once, unprompted, while I was cleaning the window behind her desk. Like, actually remembers. The guys on the loading dock, the woman who runs the mail room, he knows their names. He asked me about my dog once when he'd only seen a photo of it once 6 months ago. She'd shaken her head like this was slightly baffling. Most alphas in his position don't see you unless they need something from you. I had made a sound I hoped conveyed neutral acknowledgement and moved to the next window. I did not need to be told these things. I did not need the picture of him to become more three-dimensional in my mind. I needed him to remain safely abstract, the CEO. The alpha, the reason I took the service entrance and wore the gray cap low and had enrolled the baby in my own insurance through the agency's coverage plan, the universe, as previously established, did not care about my needs. The first close call came on a Wednesday in my 7th week. I had miscalculated. I'd stayed later than usual on the 3rd floor because a water bottle spill near the printer station had required more attention than expected, and by the time I'd finished, the building's daytime population was beginning to arrive. I should have taken the service stairs immediately. Instead I'd made the mistake of going for the supply closet first, wanting to return my cart before heading out. And the supply closet on the 3rd floor was around a corner from the main elevator bank. I heard the elevator arrive before I saw it. Heard the particular weighted silence that precedes important arrivals, the way people around me went slightly more upright, slightly more composed. I was already moving toward the service door when I heard his voice. I hadn't heard his voice in 14 months. Not since a morning when I'd been half asleep and he'd said something quiet near the window about the city that I hadn't fully registered and had spent months afterward trying to reconstruct. He was speaking to someone, an assistant, probably, in that particular even cadence that I remembered, not loud. Not performative, simply clear. The voice of a man who expected to be heard without needing to raise his volume. He was talking about a morning meeting, something about projections, and the words themselves were entirely ordinary. I was through the service door before he rounded the corner. I stood on the other side of the fire door with my back against the cold metal and one hand pressed flat to the curve of my stomach, and I breathed very carefully for 30 seconds. The baby shifted. A slow, questioning roll, like he was asking what all the stillness was about. Nothing, I told him internally. Everything is fine. We're fine. I believed this with approximately 60% confidence, which I considered a reasonable margin given the circumstances. After that, I was more careful. I mapped his arrival patterns through Dev's accidental intelligence briefings and adjusted my exit times accordingly. I added an extra 10 minutes of buffer to every shift. I learned which routes through the building were least likely to cross paths with the executive floor's early arrivals. I also, for reasons I refused to examine, started paying closer attention to the way people talked about him, not obsessively. Not in any way that I would have described to myself as obsessive. But the picture Dev and Petra and even Yusuf, who'd made a single offhand comment once about management that had clearly been intended as a compliment in disguise, were painting was of someone I didn't quite recognize from my brief weeks of knowing him. The Kale Draven I had known had been, not cold, exactly, but contained. Like a fire built in a very efficient furnace, enormous heat, minimal external expression. He'd been kind in that evening's conversation but in a way that had felt like precision rather than warmth. Like someone who had learned the language of warmth and spoke it fluently without it being quite his native tongue, the person Dev described, who remembered a loading dock worker's recent promotion, who had apparently once delayed a company-wide announcement by 2 days because he'd wanted to personally brief the department most affected before they heard it through official channels, sounded like someone who had been practicing something. Getting better at it, I spent considerable mental energy telling myself this was irrelevant information, the pregnancy was becoming impossible to hide, I'd known this was coming. There had been a window of denial, baggy uniform, careful posture, strategic cart positioning whenever anyone looked my direction, but by month 6 the geometry of the situation had overtaken any concealment strategy. I was visibly, undeniably pregnant, and the only reason no one had commented directly was the collective, unspoken agreement among my colleagues to treat this as simply a fact of my presence rather than a subject for discussion. Dolores had, without comment, begun finishing my heavier tasks on the days when I arrived looking particularly tired. Yusuf had officially reduced my workload on the record, citing a safety accommodation protocol that I'm fairly certain he had partially invented, and had done it with such administrative confidence that no one had questioned it. Marcus continued the coffee. A woman named Hira who cleaned the 8th floor had started leaving crackers and individually wrapped cheese portions in the service lounge on the mornings she knew I'd be there. They fed me. They lightened my work. They said absolutely nothing about any of it. I had long since stopped pretending to myself that I didn't love them for it. What I hadn't anticipated was the morning Yusuf called me into his office, a storage room that he'd organized into a surprisingly functional workspace, and looked at me with that careful expression I'd learned to recognize as him making a decision about honesty. "Elian," he said. "I want you to know that whatever decisions you've made about your situation are yours to make, and my job is to support you in doing your job, not to involve myself in your personal life." "Thank you," I said. He nodded slowly. "I also want you to know that I've worked in this building for 11 years. I have a very good memory for faces." He paused. "And I read the news." Occasionally, I looked at him for a long moment. "I see," I said. "Good," he said. That's all I wanted to say. He went back to his scheduling sheet. I went back to my cart. We never spoke of it again. But something shifted, some last pretense of neutrality dissolved, and the care my colleagues had been showing me quietly became something slightly less concealed. Dolores started checking in with me directly at the start of each shift. Hira offered to trade assignments whenever mine required significant physical strain. Marcus had, apparently, mentioned something to someone in building maintenance, because a padded stool had appeared in the second-floor supply closet near my most used area with a post-it note that said for breaks in handwriting I didn't recognize. The building was holding me. I tried very hard not to need that. I had a long history of not needing things. It was a skill I'd developed young, in a family that had needed so much from me that there'd been no room for the reverse direction. Not needing was safe. Not needing was manageable, but at 6 months pregnant and tired in a way that sleep didn't fully address, alone in a city that had been indifferent to me for most of my adult life. Being held by a group of people who asked nothing in return was quietly dismantling something I'd built a long time ago. I cried on the service stairs once. Not for long. Just 30 seconds of leaning against the railing with my hand on my stomach while the baby did his reassuring rolling thing, and then I straightened up and went back to work. It began like any other Tuesday. I arrived at 5:40. I clocked in through the service entrance, collected my cart, exchanged a nod with Yusuf who was already reviewing the morning's assignments. Dolores was in the break room with her hard candies and a complaint about the third-floor vacuum suction, which she was relating to Hira with the same energy other people might bring to a thriller novel. I poured my coffee from the community maker and stood near the window for a moment looking out at the pre-dawn street. My back ached. It had started aching more consistently over the past week, a deep pull that the prenatal exercises I'd found online helped with but didn't eliminate. The baby was positioned low, I'd read enough to understand what that probably meant about timing, about the approach of something that was no longer abstract, and the weight distribution had changed in ways my body was still negotiating. I worked the second floor. I worked it slowly and carefully, and I thought about nothing in particular, which was the meditative state I discovered that floor mopping produced when you stopped fighting it. The marble caught the early light coming off the street. The building hummed. Somewhere above me, the corporate world was beginning to turn. I was finishing the corridor near the East Conference Room when my phone vibrated with a message from the antenatal clinic I'd been attending through the public health system. A reminder about my next appointment, in 2 weeks. I stopped to read it and then stood there for a moment doing the arithmetic of my schedule against the appointment time, making the small calculations of a person managing a life on narrow margins. I didn't hear him arrive, I heard, instead, the particular quality of silence that preceded him. The way the air changed. Or maybe that was memory, overlaid on the present, my nervous system responding to a scent that hadn't yet reached me consciously, and then it did, cedar and rain and that darker undertone that I had told myself for 14 months I had exaggerated in recollection. I had not exaggerated it. I turned slowly because turning fast wasn't something my body did gracefully anymore, and he was there. Cale Draven was standing at the end of the corridor, having apparently come from the direction of the conference room rather than the elevator, and he was looking at me. He was exactly as I remembered him and completely different. The same strong lines of his face, the same dark eyes that I'd always thought saw more than he let on. The same quality of stillness in his bearing that I'd once found, against all my better judgment, profoundly safe. He was wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my rent. His assistant was a few steps behind him, holding a tablet and wearing the expression of someone recalibrating their morning rapidly. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. I stood in the corridor with my mop handle in one hand and my other hand very carefully not pressed to my stomach the way it reflexively wanted to be, and I thought, this is the moment. Here it is. The silence lasted approximately 4 seconds. It felt geological. Elian, he said, not a question. He said my name the way someone says a word they've been holding in their mouth for a long time. Testing whether it still fit, Mr. Draven, I said. My voice came out steady. I was briefly proud of that. Something moved across his face. Something I didn't have the vocabulary for. His assistant behind him, a young alpha woman with close-cropped hair and an expression of heroic composure, said, "Sir, the 8 o'clock," and he raised one hand slightly without looking at her and she stopped. His eyes moved. Just briefly, for half a second, down and back up. Taking in what was undeniable, the geometry of 6 months that no gray uniform could contain anymore, the expression on his face when his eyes returned to mine was something I had never seen there before. Something that was not contained at all. "How long?" he said, and his voice was very quiet. "Have you been here?" 3 months, I said. The corridor was very still. I could hear the ventilation. I could hear my own heartbeat, which had decided this was an appropriate moment to become audible. 3 months, he repeated. "It's a legitimate position," I said. "I went through the agency." "I'm not," I stopped. "I'm not what?" "I'm not here for anything from you. I'm not making a claim. I'm not doing the thing you're thinking I'm doing." He took one step toward me and then stopped, like he'd checked himself. His jaw was tight. His hands were very still at his sides, which I recognized, from our brief weeks of knowing each other. As the way he looked when he was working very hard to not do something. "You're pregnant," he said. Still quiet. Still that terrible stillness. "Yes, and you took a job." I needed work. "The agency placed me here." I considered. I paused. I considered not accepting, but the terms worked for my schedule and the pay was consistent and I made a decision. "That you wouldn't tell me." "Yes." Something in his expression shifted. Not to anger, which I'd been braced for. To something I could only describe as pain, which I had not been braced for at all. "Elian, I'm going to need to finish this floor," I said, because I was not prepared for whatever was about to happen and the floor needed finishing, and if I kept talking about practical things I might get through the next 60 seconds without doing something irreversible. "I have a schedule. If you want to have a conversation I'm available after my shift ends." "You have a schedule," he said, and there was something in it that wasn't quite disbelief but was close to it. "Yes. I have a job. Which I take seriously, because I need it." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at my mop. Then he looked back at me, and something in his face was doing something I couldn't catalog, a rapid processing that moved through several expressions before settling on a resolved, deliberate calm. "What time does your shift end?" he said. "7:30. I'll be in the third floor conference room at 7:30, Mr. Draven, Elian." His voice was still quiet. Still so terribly quiet. "Please," I looked at him. At those dark eyes that had apparently memorized the loading dock staff's promotions and delayed company announcements for the sake of the people most affected. At the man who was so contained and who was not, at this moment, contained at all. 7:30, I said. He nodded once, turned, and walked back the way he had come. His assistant followed, and as she passed me she gave me a look that contained an entire novel's worth of information, not unkind, not judgmental, just deeply, exhaustedly knowing, and I understood, suddenly and completely, that she had known I was here, they had all known I was here, the staff of Voshale Enterprises. From Yusuf and Dolores and Hira to Marcus and the maintenance team and apparently the CEO's own assistant, had known that the pregnant janitor on the morning shift was something more than a pregnant janitor, and they had said absolutely nothing, they had just taken care of me and waited. I stood alone in the corridor with my mop and the quiet building and the soft movement of the baby who had apparently decided this was a good moment to make his presence felt, and I thought, well. I finished the floor. I realize this might seem like the least important detail, but it mattered to me. I finished the floor with the same care I'd given it every morning for 3 months because the floor deserved it and because the act of finishing the thing I'd started was the only thing I had complete control over in the next 2 hours, and I was going to exercise that control with conviction. Dolores found me in the service corridor at 7:15. She looked at my face for approximately 3 seconds and then handed me a hard candy without a word. I unwrapped it and put it in my mouth and we stood in companionable silence for a moment. "You know," I said finally. She said. "How long?" She tilted her head slightly. "Since about week 2. You have his eyes. And your mother was in the news a few years back, the company acquisition coverage had family photos." She paused. "Yusuf figured it out around the same time. Marcus, genuinely don't know how Marcus figured it out, that man has some kind of intuition that science can't explain, and you just, kept quiet," she said. "Because you were keeping quiet. Because it wasn't our business and because you were working hard and doing a good job and whatever you'd decided about your life, you'd decided it." She looked at me steadily. "We're not here to make other people's difficult situations more difficult, Elian. That's not what we do." I looked at the ceiling for a moment because I was not going to cry in the service corridor 16 minutes before a conversation that required me to be functional. "He's asked to meet with me," I said. "I know." At my look, she added, "The building has ears. You learn to stop being surprised by that." She paused. "Are you going to be all right?" "I don't know," I said, which was the most honest answer I'd given anyone in months. She nodded like this was a completely acceptable answer. "The conference room has good chairs. The cushioned ones, not the hard ones. I cleaned it this morning and I left the windows angled for ventilation." She reached into her pocket and produced 2 more hard candies. Pressed them into my palm. For afterward, I held the candies and thought about the extraordinary specificity of being loved by practical people. "Thank you," I said. "Go," she said. "You're going to be late." The third floor conference room had good light at this hour. Morning sun through the north-angled windows, which didn't give direct glare but filled the room with a clean, even brightness. Dolores had indeed left the ventilation optimal. The cushioned chairs were arranged around one end of the long table, rather than across it, which either said something about whoever had arranged them or was a coincidence I was choosing not to read. Cale was already there, he'd removed his suit jacket. Which I registered as significant in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. He was standing at the window when I entered, and he turned when he heard the door, and the morning light was behind him, and everything about the moment had the quality of something that had been building for a long time reaching a necessary point. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I said I would, I know." He moved away from the window, not toward me but to the side of the table, and his hands were at his sides again with that careful stillness. "Please sit." "If you want to," I sat. The cushioned chair was, as advertised, much better than the alternative. The baby stretched, a long, whole-body movement that pressed against my ribs, and I breathed through it quietly. Kale sat across the small angle from me, close enough for a normal conversation but not so close as to be imposing. I noted this. I was noting everything with the hypervigilance of someone who's been managing alone for a long time and doesn't entirely know how to stop. Tell me what happened, he said. From your perspective. All of it, if you're willing. I looked at him. You know what happened, I said. I know facts, he said. I don't know what you experienced. I don't know why you made the choices you made. And he stopped. Pressed his lips together briefly. I've spent the last 45 minutes realizing how little I understood about how that night ended from where you were standing. And I'd like to understand. If you'll let me, I studied his face. The openness there was not something I remembered from our time together. Or maybe it was something that had always been there and I'd been too focused on not needing anything to see it clearly. You left a card, I said. Your assistant's card. Not yours. Something shifted in his expression. I know, that was a message, yes, he said, and his voice was tight with something. It was a very stupid message from a man who had completely miscalculated the situation and didn't realize it for several weeks, and by then I had no way to reach you. Because I'd left you a card for my assistant instead of myself. He said this with the particular precise self-condemnation of someone who has been having this conversation with himself for a long time. I thought I was being, he paused. I thought leaving my personal details would seem presumptuous. Like I was assuming you wanted more when we hadn't discussed more. I was trying not to put pressure on you. I looked at him. You were trying not to pressure me, I said carefully, by making it easy for you to reach me only through professional channels, which communicated exactly the opposite of what I intended. His jaw tightened. I am aware of how that sounds. How long, I said slowly, until you realized the miscalculation. 3 weeks, he said. When I accepted that you weren't going to call because you'd read the card exactly as anyone with sense would read it. His dark eyes met mine directly. I looked for you. I didn't have your surname. We'd only ever exchanged first names. I knew the charity event, I knew roughly who'd been invited. He stopped. I know that probably sounds, you looked for me, yes, I sat with that for a moment. Sat with the image of him on the other side of those 14 months, doing something I hadn't imagined him doing. I found out I was pregnant about 2 months after, I said. I'd decided by then that you'd made your intentions clear. I didn't want to be the person who turns up with a pregnancy as leverage. Or to complicate your life. Or to put you in a position where you felt obligated. He listened. He didn't interrupt. I had enough to manage without adding someone else's complicated feelings about obligation to it, I said. And I had some of my own. About accepting help. About needing things. I paused. I took the job because I needed work and it fit my schedule. I took it knowing you were the CEO and deciding that we wouldn't cross paths, and that was a decision I made and I stand by the logic of it even if it was wrong, he said. Even if I might have decided differently, I said, which was more honest and felt more true. The room was quiet. Somewhere in the building a phone was ringing, muffled by distance and walls. I don't know what you want, I said. From this conversation. I gestured vaguely. I'm not here to ask you for anything. I want to be clear about that. I'm here because you asked and because I've apparently lost the ability to refuse things in this building since everyone in it has been quietly taking care of me for 3 months and I seem to have misplaced my independent streak somewhere near the east stairwell. Something happened to his expression that I hadn't seen before. Something that started at the corners of his eyes and moved inward, like light arriving slowly. The staff, he said carefully, they knew, I said. I don't know when they figured it out or how, but they knew. They modified my workload without telling me. They left food and equipment adjustments and, I stopped. Yusuf filed a safety accommodation for me. Dolores finishes my heavy assignments. There is a padded stool in the second-floor supply closet that appeared 3 weeks ago with a post-it note that says for breaks. He was very still. They didn't tell you, he said. No, they knew who you were. Knew you were carrying, he stopped. And they just took care of things, I said. Yes, he looked at the table for a moment. When he looked back up, the expression on his face was the one I didn't have a vocabulary for, the one that had appeared in the corridor and that I'd been circling around since. I've been trying, he said, for the past few years, to build something here. A culture, I suppose. The kind of organization where people matter as themselves, not just as functions. He paused. I didn't know, until this morning, whether it had actually taken. Whether I'd actually succeeded in making this place what I wanted it to be, or whether it was still just, he shook his head slightly. Apparently it took, yes, I said. Apparently it did. We looked at each other across the small distance of the conference table, in the morning light, with the building around us and all its quietly extraordinary people, and something that had been held at a distance for a very long time began, carefully, to close. I want to ask you something, Cale said. And I want you to know before I ask it that your answer doesn't change anything about your employment status or your situation here. And that I'm asking because I want to know, not because I want something from you. Ask, I said, what do you need? I looked at him. Not what I think you should have, he said. Not what I want to offer. What do you actually need right now? No one had asked me that. Not directly. In 14 months of managing this alone, not one person had sat across from me and asked that question without it carrying its own agenda, its own shape of what the answer should be. The baby moved. A soft, steady flutter, his Tuesday morning rhythm. I need my job, I said honestly. I need the income for another 2 months minimum. I need to deliver safely. I stopped, recalibrated. I need to not feel like I've made a catastrophic mistake that I can't recover from. I've been managing that last one with varying success. You haven't, he said immediately. You don't know that. Every decision you've made has been rational given the information you had. He said. You read a message and responded to it logically. You found stable work when you needed it. You've been building something for this child despite significant obstacles and very little support. He paused. I know that because I can see the shape of it from here. The cost of it too. I didn't say anything. I made the first mistake, he said. I want the chance to, not fix it, I can't fix it, but to do something different from this point forward. If you're willing, what does different look like? I said. I don't know exactly, he said, which I had not expected. I know what I want it to look like, but I don't think my wants are the relevant variable right now. I think what it looks like should be something we decide. Not something I decide and present to you. I studied him. Studied the careful way he was holding himself, the effort of a naturally decisive man making himself wait, making room for someone else's pace. You're different, I said. From what? From who you were. Or from who I thought you were. I paused. The man I met at the gala was kind. But at a distance. Like kindness was something you did rather than something you were. This feels different. He was quiet for a moment. I've been told that, he said finally. That I used to be better at performing the right behaviors than actually inhabiting them. A pause. I've been working on the difference, for a specific reason. He met my eyes. Yes, the morning light was shifting. In the corridor outside, I could hear the sounds of the building fully waking, footsteps, conversation, the distant chime of elevators. The day was beginning in earnest. I have a prenatal appointment in 2 weeks, I said. At the public clinic. I've been going alone. Something in his face changed. Not dramatically. Just a slight shift, like a door opening. I'd like to come, he said. If you're willing. It's early, I said. There's nothing decided. I'm not saying, I know, he said. I'm not asking for decisions. I'm asking to be there. I looked at him for a long moment. At the patience in his face, the held stillness of it. At the dark eyes that I'd spent 14 months trying not to think about. Okay, I said. He exhaled. A small thing, barely audible. But I heard it. That was in the morning. By afternoon, the building's information ecosystem had clearly processed the morning's events in its own way. Dolores had apparently said nothing directly to anyone, but she moved through the day with the particular satisfied energy of a person whose long bet had paid off. Yusuf seemed lighter somehow, less careful, less watchful, a man released from a vigil he'd been keeping. Even Marcus, who I only saw in passing, gave me a nod that had more weight in it than usual. I worked my afternoon touch-up shift with a quality of stillness inside me that was new. Not resolution, I wasn't fool enough to call it that, not with so much still uncertain, so much still to navigate. But something quieter than the braced tension I'd been carrying for 3 months. Some fundamental loosening. Cale had, before we left the conference room, given me his actual number. Not his assistant's. His. He'd offered it on a card, then seemed to reconsider the symbolism of that, put the card away, and said the number out loud until I'd entered it in my phone. He'd watched me do it with an expression that was almost wry, almost self-aware, and I had almost laughed, and almost laughing was more progress than I'd made in months. He'd also, and I told him this wasn't necessary and he'd said he understood but he was doing it anyway, called Yusuf to adjust my shift assignment to the hours that best suited my physical needs rather than the building's conventional schedule. He'd done it in front of me, standing in the corridor, and Yusuf had answered with the tone of a man receiving a call he'd been expecting, and the call had lasted 90 seconds and when it ended Yusuf had appeared at the service door 10 minutes later and told me my schedule had been officially adjusted and also that my coffee supply in the service lounge would be upgraded from the community pot to the premium blend, which was apparently a significant privilege that the clean office had been. Gatekeeping, you didn't have to do that, I'd said to Cale, before he returned to his day. I know, he'd said. That's not the point, I thought about that while I worked the afternoon shift. About the difference between things done from obligation and things done from choice. About how the distinction mattered, had always mattered, and about how I'd spent so long managing from a position where I expected one and not the other. The baby rolled. His reliable, grounding presence. I pressed a hand briefly to my side, feeling the movement, and thought, we're okay. We're going to be okay. It wasn't certainty. It wasn't resolution. But it was something I could stand on. In the weeks that followed, things shifted in the way that things shift when they're real, not dramatically, not with the sweeping narrative arc of something designed for easy consumption, but in increments. In Tuesday messages and one prenatal appointment that was awkward in the first 10 minutes and then wasn't. In an evening when he'd asked if he could come to mine for a simple dinner and I'd said yes, and he'd brought groceries and cooked with the careful focus of someone who'd learned to cook as a practical skill and hadn't expected to feel anything about it, and we'd sat across a kitchen table that was technically mine but felt suddenly shared, and we'd talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with any of it, about cities, about what it meant to build something that lasted, about the particular grief of losing a family to decisions rather than death. And somewhere in the third hour he'd said something and I'd said something back and we'd both stopped and looked at each other and the air between us had been the same as it had been in a hotel room 14 months ago. And different, and more, I had let him stay, not from heat. Not from instinct, though both were present and both were persuasive. From choice. From the slow accumulation of evidence about who he was, and from the equally slow dismantling of my belief that choosing myself meant never choosing anyone else. He was careful with me in the way of a man who understood that care was not the same as caution. He was present in the way of a man who had learned the difference between performing presence and actually being there. He was funny, quietly, in the way I hadn't remembered because I'd been so busy being on guard I'd missed it, dry and slightly absurdist, making observations about the world that were accurate enough to be devastating and delivered with such composure that it took a second to realize how sharp they were. He talked to the baby once. Early morning, when he thought I was still asleep, sitting on the edge of the bed with his hand on the curve of my side and his voice so low I could barely hear it. Not saying anything for me. Just talking. Like making an introduction. Like beginning something. I lay very still and let him. The baby came in the 7th month, not the 9th, a development that, in the clinical language of the midwife, was earlier than optimal but well within manageable parameters. In the more immediate language of the experience, it was terrifying and fast and happened on a night when Cale was there and Dolores was, extraordinarily, also there because she had developed the habit of calling me on Thursday evenings to check in. And she had heard something in my voice during that call that brought her to my door with her car keys and her hard candies and that particular brand of practical ferocity that I had come to think of as her defining characteristic. She was in the waiting room when Cale came to find her, 2 hours later, to tell her. I learned afterward that she had cried. That she had argued this with him aggressively, insisted that she was not a crier, that she had worked in building services for 22 years and had developed immunity to sentiment, that whatever he thought he'd seen had been a reaction to the recycled hospital air. He had apparently agreed with each point with complete seriousness while she recovered her composure. He had his own composure to recover. He'd been shaking when he came back to me, barely, the kind of shaking that only showed if you were watching the hands, and I'd reached for him without thinking, which was so far from where I'd started that if you'd shown the moment to the version of me standing in the corridor 3 months ago I wouldn't have believed it. He's all right, the midwife had said. Early but strong, and he was. He was extraordinary. He was small in the way premature things are small, with a concentrated urgency to him, a compact insistence on existing that struck me immediately as the most him thing I had ever seen. His name, we had not discussed names. There had been so many other things to discuss first, came to me while I was holding him that first hour. Cale had his hand on my shoulder and was looking at this small new person with an expression I'd never seen on any human face and didn't have words for. Oren, I said, a pause. Then, yes, we didn't discuss it further. It was just true. 3 months after Oren was born, I went back to the building, not to work. My position had been adjusted to a part-time administrative role that Yusuf had proposed and Cale had facilitated and that I'd accepted after considerable internal debate about whether I was comfortable with the convergence of my personal and professional life into something this entangled. I'd decided I was. With conditions. The conditions were that my role be genuinely useful rather than decorative, that my employment decisions remain with building services management rather than the executive suite, and that no one in the company be required to treat me as anything other than Elian Marsh in a professional context until I decided otherwise. All conditions accepted, I came back on a Tuesday morning. Early enough that the lobby was still in the pre-business quiet I loved, the marble lit by the same pre-dawn glow I'd memorized. The service entrance was still my preferred door. The second-floor corridor had a new cleaning cart parked near the supply closet. Someone newer than me was handling the route now. And I hoped they appreciated the good acoustics. Dolores found me in the break room, which was exactly what I expected. She handed me a hard candy. I took it. You look better, she said. I feel better, I said, which was true in a way that went further than physical recovery. Oren, at home with his father, who is taking the full parental leave allocation and treating it with approximately the same focused intensity he brings to mergers. I paused. Yusuf told me there's been a standing company policy update extending parental leave for all employees. Full pay, both parents. Dolores's expression didn't change, but something in her eyes was deeply satisfied. Corporate culture trickles down. She said, with the serenity of a person who has been right about something for a long time. It does, I agreed. We drank our coffee and watched the building wake up around us. The elevators began their morning cycles. The ventilation shifted up a register. Somewhere above us, the day was beginning in all its complicated ordinary glory. I thought about a corridor and a mop and a gray cap pulled low. I thought about a padded stool with a post-it note. I thought about hard candies and adjusted schedules and a building full of people who had looked at an impossible situation and decided, collectively, that the appropriate response was care. I thought about a man standing at a window in morning light. Making room. I thought about Oren, who had his father's jaw and my stubbornness and who had arrived in the world a little early and certain, insisting on his place with every breath. Thank you, I said to Dolores, for the candy, for all of it. She waved a hand. We take care of our own, she said. That's just what we do. The building hummed around us. The marble caught the first clean light of the morning. I put the hard candy in my mouth and tasted something sweet and specific, the flavor of a particular kind of kindness, not grand, not performed, not conditional, just steady. Just here, just ours.